Welcome to New West Press Audio, the official podcast of New West Press. We're an independent publishing outfit located in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. My name is Matt Bowes, and I'm the general manager here at New West. And with me today is Matthew Tétreault, author of the new novel Hold Your Tongue. Matthew, how are you today?
I'm doing very well, thank you. How are you?
Uh, you know, Getting over some stuff, but my voice is a little foggy. I was just getting over COVID, but
Hmm.
it's better now. We've been signing off our emails to each other, Matt and Matt. So,
Yeah,
pretty,
sometimes
pretty.
I forget who wrote what email sometimes.
Yeah, we should have like Matt One and Matt Alpha so we can keep each other straight.
Yeah.
But your novel, Hold Your Tongue, is coming out this spring, and it's part of our Nunatak First Fiction series. So, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about your book?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, so Hold Your Tongue is a fictional exploration of Francophone Métis experiences in Southeast Manitoba. It follows a protagonist who is confronted with the illness of a relative, his great uncle, and this sets off a bit of a journey to tell his father about it, and it gets him thinking about the town that he's growing up in, St. Anne, Manitoba. Gets him thinking about what it means to be from there, to be a francophone. Memories are flooding his mind, that sort of thing, and so it's a bit of a journey through place, through belonging, and then through language as well, which is an important component of the books.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it stream of consciousness per se, but there's definitely like it really weaves its way through your main character's memories, and then he talks to someone, he remembers something they said, and then layered on that is also like three different languages too, right? Because you got English
Hmm.
and then French Canadian French, which for our international listeners is definitely different from France French, and I would say Manitoban French is probably pretty different from Quebecois French too. And then you've got Michif, the language of Métis people. So
Hmm.
how did you kind of reconcile all of the different elements going on? Because it's quite a complicated novel when you look at it line by line.
Yeah. So there's a couple different points to that. I mean, so the first is I was trying to emulate Métis storytelling structures on the one point. Um, so indigenous storytelling structures, which are not always necessarily linear,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes they come in bits and pieces, and it's by juxtaposing and getting to the end that everything sort of falls into place, and then you understand, like, say, a larger narrative or something along those lines. And so that was part of what I was playing with. Um, and then the idea of representing, francophone experiences in a predominantly anglophone province. I mean, Manitoba is predominantly anglophone, as is most of Western Canada, I believe. And so, uh, to represent francophone experiences, I had to bring in some of that language. Um, there are some people who maintain a predominantly francophone existence, despite being in a predominantly anglophone place. But I was interested in that space kind of in between languages, not quite language loss, but still, being a sort of a bilingualism, a franglais, as you will. And so I wanted to incorporate that into the text. And then being Métis as well, I wanted to incorporate the idea of Michif a little bit as well. There are still some Michif speakers out there, but a lot of Métis families no longer speak Michif. And so I wanted to sort of play around with representing that sort of language loss, going from Michif to French to English, and try to weave all of this in together. And so, yeah, it definitely took a while to write and think through what parts of the narrative to write in what language was definitely a challenge, and a lot of it was feeling and
Mm-hmm.
almost music and rhythm as well. Um, Understanding when in a scene it would make sense, it would look good, that it would sound good as well. So yeah, it was really fun to play around with that until it sounded great.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of our book we did with Lee Miracle quite a few years ago called Memory Serves, because
Mm.
she was working with the Stow Low oral tradition. And I
Mm.
remember it took them quite a long time to be able to condense, not condense, but translate into printed and, short articles, I guess. Because the way she would say it out loud would be probably very different and very recursive and kind of all like playing with the crowd too and checking their
Mm.
vibe and like kind of going with that. So did you find, especially when working in Michif, like the translation, I guess what I'm wondering is in your head and thinking from that oral storytelling standpoint, is it difficult to translate that into print and something that non-Michif speakers and probably a lot of non-French speakers are going to have to work a little bit to get through? But you know, like,
Mhm.
well, go through your process on that a little.
Yeah, for sure. So, I was definitely drawing from. So, first of all, there's different varieties of Michif. There's Cree Michif and French Michif, and different communities in Western Canada will have slightly different versions of Michif. There's not really a standard version, and so I was drawing from more francophone Michif versions, French Michif. So that might be found in, say, the Interlake area of Manitoba. And then I was also drawing from just from memory of, my dad would take me to the restaurant in St. Anne when I was a kid, and just hearing old guys sitting around a table talking and just trying to remember the rhythm of their sentences, remember how
Mm-hmm.
they would pronounce words. And so just drawing from that, and then trying to represent that textually was interesting. And so there's not really a standard orthography, not a standard way of spelling yet, these varieties of Michif. And so I was going for a sort of a phonetic way. And so for Francophone readers who will be reading the text, the words might look familiar in a certain way, um, but then they also might look off.
Yeah.
It's not, it's not your standard French. But if you read it phonetically, then you start to hear the accent of that Michif kind of come through the words, and so
Mm-hmm.
that's sort of how that works. Um, and I think I might have incorporated one or two Cree words, just to really gesture toward that aspect and that influence as well to the Michif language. Michif is not just French. I mean, it's French and Cree or French and Saulteaux, depending on which community
Mm-hmm.
you're talking about in Western Canada. But yeah, so I just tried to incorporate just a little bit of that to gesture toward that broader influence as well.
Now, this might be a bit of a weird comparison, but it kind of reminded me of like me being a modern day English speaker and uh, taking French immersion. When I was looking at Chaucer, and
Mm.
like you could get the gist of what he's saying by kind of saying like, yeah, it's if you read it out loud, it's just like, oh yeah, I get it, and then you could
Mhm.
see how the language turned into English. But with Michif, it's working with a bunch of different language patterns together, so it is kind of a fun little exercise in addition to seeing because you see each character and you're like, okay, they have this sort of style of speaking. They're a bit older. They have a bit of older slang. So yeah, I think it's really flavorful, for lack of a better term. Um,
Mhm.
there's a graphic novel I really liked a few years ago by a guy named David Mazzucchelli called Asterios Polyp. It's a weird name. It's the main character's name. He's
Mm.
a architect, and what he did in that was each person had a different font and sort of like word balloon style for themselves and color.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
you could always tell who was talking, even if like their face wasn't there too. And that's kind of the
Yeah.
sense I got from your book too. It's just each person has their own sort of intonations, and you can work it out, in long dialogue scenes when everyone's bouncing off of each other. So yeah, I like the kind of like maybe not bullshittery, but kind of people messing with each other and just kind of small town stuff like that. That felt incredibly realistic, regardless of what language it is. People
Yeah.
are always just
Absolutely.
kind of going off on each other.
Yeah.
So is the characters kind of based on people you know, or how did you come up with them?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure my parents will recognize themselves, bits of themselves in the main character and Richard's parents in the book. They're not my parents.
Yeah.
I've taken elements from it, and so I've taken elements from a variety of people I know, and fused them together into different characters, and just invented some characters outright. The great uncle Alfred in the novel is my idea of what a grandfather should be. Like I never, all my grandparents, I had one grandmother alive when I was a kid. Otherwise, I never had any grandfathers growing up. And so it's, my idea of what a grandfather might
Mm-hmm.
be. So he's kind of yeah, he's an imaginary figure that it's not really based off of anyone.
Mm-hmm.
Though it might be based off of a few like mentors I've had along the way, just bits and pieces. But yeah, so there's a nice mix of characters are, who have characteristics that are drawn from people that I've known, and then there are others that are just purely inventions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah,
For legal purposes, these the bad ones, they're all invented.
yeah, absolutely.
The ones you wouldn't want to hang out with, those guys made them all up. So something I was meaning to ask, I think that the blurb we got on the cover is pretty a little hyperbolic, but pretty cool. Tom Wharton says that you are to, Métis literature what James Joyce was to Irish. So as the new James Joyce, how does that feel?
I mean, I was definitely floored and taken aback by that comment, and like really honored. I mean, full disclosure, Tom was my supervisor when I was doing my MA thesis at the University of Alberta, which is where this version of this novel originally, like, it originated from. It took a number of years of revisions afterwards to get it to the point where I was satisfied with it. But
Mhm.
yeah, Tom and I go back a little ways. But yeah, it was very kind, and it's kind of funny that the James Joyce comparison is there, because Joyce is obviously an influence of mine as well. I think he's an influence of a lot of people who maybe started with short stories or something.
Yeah.
Um, it's definitely something that I've read before. Both his short story collection and then Ulysses as well was really kind of mind blowing.
The journey your character takes too kind of has added significance, not unlike Bloom in Ulysses. Like
Yeah,
he's going on a fairly simple task and runs into people, but like expands outward, and the language itself kind of makes it into a bigger thing than if you were to just spread it down like matter of fact, right? Like it's different. But so
absolutely.
it's interesting. It's that storytelling tradition of a
There is
story
something
grows in the telling.
allegorical. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Like I'm trying to work on different levels. I mean, there is this straightforward, you know, narrative, but it's almost that's not really what it's about. It's
yeah.
about the allegory of the people, the allegory of the nation as well. So Richard is, kind of embodying larger narratives as he's going through his daily life, and so maybe that's a point of comparison as well. Absolutely.
Hmm. Yeah. So, like you said, you worked with Tom Warren on this book, and you were up until pretty recently living here in Edmonton. And I've
Mhm.
noticed that Edmonton has had a set of young Métis authors come out recently. So Connor Kerr with Avenue of Champions, and he's got a new one coming out. Matthew Weagle, the poet with White Mud Walking, and I would say
Mhm.
yourself. You're an Edmontonian. You're stuck with us. So,
Mhm.
do
Seven
you think
years
that
there,
there's
so yeah.
yeah. Do you think that there's something in the water here that's attracting Métis authors, or what is it? Is there kind of a resurgent Métis identity here, and presumably in Winnipeg too? Like, what? Do you have any
Mhm.
thoughts on that?
I do think I mean it's homeland. It's the Métis homeland. It's part of it. I think
Hmm.
there's a Métis scholar, Chris Anderson, I think, who's described Winnipeg and Edmonton as the beating hearts of the Métis nation that pull in and draw people, circulation of people and whatnot. And so I do think there's something to that. And so Edmonton is probably the western heart, where Winnipeg is
Hmm.
the eastern heart. And so, yeah, Edmonton it's got the University of Alberta as well, which I think plays a big factor in it. The creative writing program there at the University of Alberta and the other universities in Edmonton. The River Valley is just so inspiring. You go
Well,
for a
that's
walk.
the Canoe Volant Festival is down there too, right?
Exactly. You go for a
That's a lot
walk
of
there
fun.
and you
Yeah,
can't help but want to create something,
yeah.
whether it be writing or some other form of art.
So you have a sample for our listeners from Hold Your Tongue. Why don't you set that up?
Sure, yeah. So I'll read the part of the first chapter here. Um, so it's obviously very early on in the narrative. Opening pages. It's titled. The chapter is titled "When the Wood Slats Cracked Like Gunshots," and here we go. This was the morning Alfred had his stroke. but I didn't know it yet as I stood in the tall grass by the fence and emptied my bladder. I had awoken to the sound of cows battering the gray-worn fence on the edge of Gautier's yard. Cold sunlight swirled like wastewater through the dusty windows as I lay in the back of the Buick and knuckle-rubbed my eyes. I swung my legs off the seat and empties clattered underfoot. Beneath the warm stink of flat beer, sweat, and cigarette smoke, her perfume lingered. We had sat for some time in the Buick, and I could still feel the imprint of her soft lips on my cheek. But something that she'd said not long before she left had given us pause. She talked about how her mother had grown up around here, but her family had left after something happened. The woman wondered if we were related. Thinking to clear things up, I pulled a bundle of papers from the glove box. My tree, I said. Someone had typed my name on the cover page. Inside, a slew of names spiderwebbed outward from my own. Branched, my sister said. Our parents and theirs still, going back years. She had put the package together and given it to me the last time I had been to the city. She told me to apply for a Métis card and said it could help me find a job or go back to school. But I had shoved the package into the glove box and forgotten about it until the woman had asked about my grandparents. In the dim glow of the roof light, I flipped through the pages, staring dumbly at the names and the dates, older than the country. Is that how people date out here? She laughed. Whip out the oak tree and check the branches before things get serious. She glanced briefly at the first page, but 2 a.m., drunk in a dirty Buick, was probably not the place to compare genealogies. The woman sucked her breath and tossed the sheaf into my lap. Before I knew it, she was gone. Alone in the dark, I finished my beer. Outside, the cows and I dribbled and wetted the earth. The dull sun climbed over the tree line, and cows ambled closer, curious, wet noses snuffing in the air. They jostled up against the old fence, trying to get a better look at me, and the wood slats cracked like gunshots against the posts, and the herd broke and thundered away into the pasture. Gautier's yard was a mess. The fire pit smoldered still. Smoke curled over the charred remains of broken furniture, the blackened ribs of a cracked wooden pallet, assorted cans and bottles, and a red plastic cup lay scattered in a wild, sloppy ring around the pit. Empties littered the path like breadcrumbs toward the farmhouse. Soiled plates and plastic cutlery peppered the grass before the fold-up tables where Gautier had brought out bologna and rye bread for a midnight snack. He had run cables from the house across the yard to power the amps on the makeshift stage where a country and western band had stomped time on a bale trailer. Folks had danced and jigged in the dew-soaked grass while fiddles squealed and fireworks tore open the night. Flowering over the field, the booming chemical crackle had driven cows further into the back pasture, where trees grew and cattle trails coiled through the stocky bush. The bonfire had swelled fat with flames gorging on the busted fence posts, the broken pallets and chairs, the dead wood gathered from the pasture that folks tossed in. Gautier circled the fire. Don't be shy now, he shouted, egging us on. The sky won't burn. J.P. Gautier had recently taken over the farm and decided to throw a party to celebrate his inheritance. His old man, Vieux Gautier, had finally moved to the old folks' home in St. Anne, and J.P. had big plans. He told everyone about them. He cornered people loading up on bologna and rye bread and yelled into their ears. Pigs, he explained. He ought to raise pigs. There had been little money in cattle since the mad cow scare. Not enough, anyways, to make a decent living. Although his old man had scratched by on cattle, J.P. had bigger ambitions. Winters in Arizonas, he shouted. That's the plan. Shuffling toward the Buick, a bolt of light in the frost-sopped grass arrested my step. I bent low and plucked a stainless steel flask from the ground. It was empty, but smelled of rye whiskey. Rising, I grunted as a hot, sharp pain seared down my leg and licked my toes. It was sometimes best not to move, I had learned, and let things settle. Ever since I started working for Uncle Joe, this pain had grown sharp and regular. Joe said it would get better, that I'd get used to it, but I wasn't so sure. Still, I figured doing nothing was worth the shot. As I stood fixed and surveyed the yard, scanning the tents under the disheveled oak and studying the RV that purred in the driveway with the quiet hum of a space heater, the pain began to ebb from my limbs. The yard looked smaller than I remembered. The grass around me lay flat, driven low, as though someone had spun donuts with a 4x4. The yard had seemed so much larger when I was a child. while Monique and I used to tag along with Dad to visit Livier Gauthier. While they sat in the kitchen chatting and sipping on brandy, I would slip outside to play in the barn or climb the trees and the fences. I would chase the barn cats through the yard and up the trees and then sit up there on some thick branch and watch JP work. He was my older cousin, and I admired him because he was old enough to drive and smoke and curse. From my perch, I watched him whip his tractor across the yard, skewer some round bales, and haul them one at a time into the pen to feed the heifers. Stopping every now and again to have a cigarette, he'd watch me from atop his tractor as I climbed that old oak tree next to the farmhouse. Then, flicking his cigarette butt onto the gravel, he would sweep his arms grandly along the length of the horizon, and then tell me how, one day, all of this, that vast stretch of rock-studded pasture, would be his. I'd wondered occasionally in the years since if he had known then just how long it would take, if JP wouldn't rather have moved to the city and taken up a trade. He'd spoken of all his plans, the cattle and chickens he would raise, the greenhouse he would build, and now the pigs that he would keep, while he waited for his old man to hand over the reins. He committed himself so fully to these visions that when they failed to come to pass, he grew bitter and resentful. He grew fat and mean-spirited, drinking too much as he waited for his old man to give way. After ma tante died, Dad stopped visiting Le Vieux. Something had been said which cut Dad up, but he'd refused to tell me what. I saw JP only occasionally, around town, or at the odd family reunion. He invited me to his party only because I bumped into him at the Tétreault last week. It had been years since I'd seen the farm, but I saw now in the early morning light how they had been unable to hold back the bush, how trees, wild grasses, and weeds pressed at the edges of the yard. Even the buildings looked weary, weathered, near ready to topple. Sprawled under the big oak, the farmhouse languished, crumbled stucco and cracked windows, shingles fluttering like a bad comb-over, saplings sprouting like ear hair in the eaves troughs. This land once belonged to Pépère, so the story went, but he lost it in a spell of bad luck. Pépère sold it for next to nothing to his beau-frère, le vieux Gauthier. I'd never known the whole of it, just muttered bits from Dad and from his brothers and sisters, enough to form some ghostly notion of what might have been, the idea that we might have been farmers. It was an old dream that had soured in the stomach. I think I'll leave it at there.
Yeah, on that cheerful note. So I remember reading that you are working on a horror book next. There's a kind of a Rougarou type story, right?
Yeah, I just recently got some Canada Art Council funding to pursue this. It's trying to write a Métis literary Western and horror novel. And so
Amazing.
it's something that I want to set in North Dakota, so in the Red River Valley, just south of the U.S.-Canada border. I guess Métis experiences south of that U.S.-Canada border is not something that we think about too much or write about too much. But obviously, before the concretization of that border,
Yeah.
the Métis, would travel back and forth, across that border. There was no border. And if you're standing in a field right by the border, you wouldn't know there's a border there either. It's just a
Yeah.
flat field. And
It's all part
so,
of the
yeah,
territory.
exactly. And so it's really something I wanted to try to explore is, those stories that happen, across the border. People who travel up and down between what is now Red River, Winnipeg, what was the Red River Settlement, and Minneapolis, in Minnesota, via, say, Grand Forks in North Dakota. There used to be a lot of cart trails going back and forth between these places. And so, yeah, I think it's that setting is really ripe for exploration, to try to reclaim and retell some of those stories and bring in things like the Rougarou, as you mentioned, but also that legend of the flying canoe, which is a
Mhm.
French Canadian legend, but French Canadian and Métis are related, and so it's definitely something that's a shared mythology there. We'll try to bring in a little bit of criticism and reflection on Catholicism and early settler colonialism in the area as well, through horror and Western tropes, and play around with that. So, yeah, it's definitely a project I'm really looking forward to working on. I've started writing just a little bit of it, and so it's I'm having a blast so far. So definitely looking forward to continuing with that over the next year or so.
Yeah, let us know when that's done. We definitely want to see it. So, but
Absolutely.
Matthew, your book is available when people are listening to this. It'll be available in stores and online. So,
Mhm.
yeah, congratulations on the book coming out,
Thank you
and
very much.
let's sell a bunch of them. Listeners, you can go to our website and pick up the book, or find it at your better bookstores out there. And Matthew, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. Have a good day.
So, yeah, this is Matt Bose from New West Press signing off.